Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Bern. I'm your host, Eric Miller. Today I'm joined by a really great advocate for UBI, Universal Basic Income. I've seen him interviewed around in multiple places, and he's a great writer and a tireless advocate for UBI, Mr. Scott Santens. How you doing, Scott?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I'm doing well. How about you?
Great, great. Thanks for taking some time to chat with me about UBI. I want to kind of frame this a little bit as UBI 101, right? And I'll
Okay.
pull up your website where you have a really, really robust FAQ. I'll pull that up, but it's obviously scottsantens.com, so people go check that out and support him. But I just wanted to kind of definitionally set up some things. We heard UBI in the presidential campaign this time around, but it wasn't in the general lexicon, 2 years ago, right? It's a relatively new topic, sort of to reach mainstream levels, right?
Mhm.
So I wanted to, pick your brain a little bit on, the benefits of it, how we can get there, et cetera, right? But just a little bit about you heretofore. How did you become sort of a UBI advocate?
Yeah, I got into this in 2013, and it was actually before the big Oxford report came out that concluded that about half of all jobs could be automated in the next 20 years. And but it was before that, and the discussion was basically along the same line. So like that hadn't hit mainstream yet, and I was just fascinated. It was a discussion at the front page of Reddit that was about like how quickly technology is advancing and how like we're not talking about what the implications of that are.
Right.
And yeah, I was just fascinated by it all. And through that, there was a book recommendation for Mana by Marshall Brain, and I read that, and that really it paints a picture of like this kind of bifurcated path that we're headed towards, or arguably already on, where we can either make technology work for all of us, or we can just like continue down this like dystopian path of things getting worse and worse. And he proposed a basic income, and that's was like, oh, what is that? And I started looking into it, and that's when I started exploring the history behind this idea, and like even like I was fascinated to learn about how we almost passed like a guaranteed income under Nixon in the early 70s, and how like it had passed the House of Representatives twice, and it didn't make it through the Senate. So like we were really close, and the same time we had actually been experimenting in cities around the country too. This was we experimented in New Jersey and North Carolina and Seattle and Denver. Like we had these really big guaranteed income experiments, and we weren't able to actually pass it. But like it would have just been world changing to set that precedent and have even other countries follow that precedent too. But he was really looking into the evidence too behind this, and aside from the history, I was just fascinated by just it was just a clear kind of picture of all these various results from the various experiments around the world. And it just seems like it's just such a great idea to actually, it can improve so many different facets of society along so many different avenues. And being just like one thing that we could do that could do so much, that's what I thought, well, I've got to like fight for this because this is like such a big thing.
Yeah, right on. I loved. Let me ask you for sort of a thumbnail definition of UBI. Can you? What's your most succinct
Sure.
definition of it?
I would define UBI as an investment of society in itself, in every individual, that is universal and unconditional and regularly provided. So those are the main conditions. So you can't means test it. It needs to go to individuals instead of households, and there's certainly no condition of work attached to it, and it doesn't decide between who's poor enough or rich enough in order to get it.
Right on. Yeah, thanks. I heard you in one of your conversations reference Monopoly. When you pass go,
Hmm.
you get $200, and that's not means tested. That's doesn't matter how many properties you own or how in the hole you are, you get the $200 when you pass go, right?
Yeah, I think Monopoly is like a really good kind of illustration because like we get the money before we even start the game. So it's not like you take out a loan or something and you owe the money back to the bank in order to like play. So you get like this unconditional cash grant to even start the game. And then yeah, you get more as each time you go around the board. And it's like you couldn't play it otherwise. So I think it's a good way of thinking, like, you know, you need this in order to actually, for the economy to function, for everything to actually, you know, work. Otherwise, you know, the game can't be played.
Right, right. And I've never, you know, I've had some heated Monopoly games, but no one has ever bemoaned the $200 when they got past go, right? Damn.
Yeah,
You
and
know.
it's interesting too. You know, there's some fun experiments you could do with Monopoly, where like, hey, what happens if you like pay everyone $1,000 every time you go around Go, or like, what happens if you kind of apply a tax differently and then like distribute that tax revenue as like a dividend to everybody around each time. So like, it's fun to kind of play around with what kind of experiences you can have through that.
That's cool. So I'm going to just kind of ask things that are probably found in your FAQ, but, you know, indulge me if you will. So where, you know, one of the common questions would be, you know, directly and indirectly, where does the money come from for UBI to pay it out?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different options available for revenue for basic income, and of course, you know, people will have their various preferences as to, you know, what is best based on the goals that they're looking to achieve from it. But I think a good way of just in looking of it in general is that we're basically already funding a basic income, but we don't look at it that way because it's all conditional. So like we have these conditional programs, especially like cash-like ones or voucher-like ones, and we're avoiding it being cash, and we're avoiding it being unconditional. And then there are these tax subsidies, the tax code. So it's like we don't call it welfare for the middle class when they get an, you know, earned income tax credit, or they get a child tax credit, or they get a home mortgage interest rate deduction, and you know, stuff like that, where or even just in general where you have like the standard deduction, like that too is like this cash like subsidy, but we don't see it that way. And then like you have the ability for the rich to just deduct and deduct and deduct and itemize their deductions. So you can get like someone, say like your Bill Gates, you know, maybe they're getting $30,000, $40,000 or something in various tax deductions. And it's like, well, why do that? Like, let's just make sure that everyone gets this same universal amount of cash unconditionally instead of all those things.
Right on. So you mentioned a few of the pilots. You know, I wasn't aware of that it had passed the House in the past, and I put a pin in that. I want to ask you why that failed and what are the obstacles. But you know, can you describe some of those pilots that have been happening?
Yeah. So first of all, like the pilots in the past were negative income tax pilots, and so a negative income tax is a guaranteed income that you vary the amount that you receive based on the amount of income that you're earning. So let's say if you're earning $0, then you would get the full $1,000 a month. But then for every dollar you earn, maybe your amount that you're getting is reduced by 50 cents, or maybe it's reduced by 40 cents or 60 cents. And in fact, that was part of what was experimented with back then, was that they would say, what happens if we claw back at a rate of 60% or 50% or 40%, to see like what are the effects on work? Because that was what was most interesting to people back then, was what happens. Do people stop working? How much does it affect their work incentive, that kind of thing. And what we learned back then was really, there were kind of three main primary effects. Was that when it came to primary earners, their work hours were affected very little. They went down, but they didn't go down because like people were working like less. It's not like they like, oh, I'm gonna spend less time on my job kind of thing. It was that they gauge this based on the whole year, and then what happened is that people who were between periods of employment spent more time looking for the next job. So then the result of that was that they would spend less total hours working that year, but it was because they were looking for a job. And you can argue that, well, I mean, that's a good thing. Like, you want people to be able to find the jobs that match their skills better, that have better wages, that have better conditions. that, people are actually finding jobs that interest them instead of just finding whatever they can find because they desperately need the job. And then they're like stuck in this job that they hate and, that's non-productive and it's just bad for everyone. So we want that better job matching. Two other primary effects were that mothers of newborn kids actually effectively used it as a paid maternity leave. So they were able to stay out of the wage labor market longer to actually spend time after the birth of their kids. Because again, we're a country that doesn't have any kind of paid maternity leave. And for students, there was a decrease in students in the labor market because what they did is, you had kids like, let's say, 16 years old or something, and they dropped out of school because they needed to help their families by earning income. And then once the family had that guaranteed income, then they were able to actually quit working and then go back to school. And so one of the interesting things that they observed in a similar negative income tax experiment in Canada, into the town of Dauphin, was that the graduation rates from high school actually increased above 100% because people who had left school actually came back to finish to the great degree that they all did, basically. So it went above 100% for that time. So that's, again, like, we want those investments to be made. Like, it's hard to look at like a work decrease in that regard and say that's bad. So it's really interesting to look at these kind of things and see that it could be really, actually a good thing, even if work is reduced.
Right. Yeah. And, coupled with that, it makes unpaid work essentially paid work, although not explicitly so, right? And it would feed entrepreneurship, presumably. One of the criticisms, and I want to get into misconceptions and critiques and things like that, but kind of since we're here, one of the criticisms maybe from the left is that it can be viewed, or it may be a bit of a Trojan horse to cut social programs, right? So in lieu of Medicare for all, or in lieu of some of the benefits that you're talking about, what's your thought on that, or what's the common thinking on that?
Yeah, I like to stress that UBI, the most important part is the U, and that we're talking about an unconditional floor that's underneath everyone. And if you have that unconditional floor, it's like building a house. Like, you can't build like a solid house that's not going to crack and crumble and collapse if you're not building it like on a firm foundation. And I think that a lot of the stuff we see is because we've built like a civilization on top of like something without a foundation. And so it's just like kind of crumbling. And so, like, when you have, say, Medicare for all, like, Medicare for all is very important. Like, we need universal healthcare. But at the same time, I would even say it's not the primary issue, because 80 to 90% of health outcomes are actually from the social determinants of health. And so you want to make sure that people actually live healthier lives, that they can eat healthier foods, that they can eat regularly, that they have food security, that they're not chronically stressed, because chronic stress leads to things like diabetes and heart disease and these things. So there's a lot of health outcomes that are the result of basically a lack of basic income. And so if we make sure that people have the basic income first, then we're going to have a healthier society, and we're not going to need to spend as much on Medicare for all, but we still need that, of course. And the same thing with education is a good example too. So we want education on top of basic income too. But without basic income, then you have kids going to school and they're hungry, they're living in stressed out home environments. And so they're not able to focus on school. They can't really, they end up, graduating with D's, or maybe they fail. And it's like, so here we're putting all this money into educate, but it's not really going as well as and effectively as it could be if we made sure that people actually had this economic security at home and sufficient resources to actually focus on education. So yeah, you got to have that firm foundation first.
Right on. So is it a misconception to say that it's, that at its core it in any way is intended to displace any of those other social programs?
I would argue that there are programs that we should be interested in replacing because of the conditions that we attach to those programs. And so if you look at like TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, is a good example. And so the TANF system is a block grant program, and the way that works is essentially we write checks to states, and then the states are supposed to use that money on their impoverished populations. And what they end up doing is actually doing all kinds of other things instead of like providing money to those in poverty. And that's a big problem. It varies a lot too. So like in Louisiana, if you look at for every 100 families in poverty in Louisiana, only 4 actually who actually receive TANF assistance. And so, 96 out of 100 people in poverty who should qualify for it don't get it. That's a big problem. And you also, there's a racial kind of thing attached to this too, because it's state by state variance. So that in states with like higher proportions of Black Americans on living in poverty who require assistance, there's a lot more strict conditions attached to that, to the assistance that they get. A lot more hoops and a lot more counterproductive, like getting them to do things that aren't actually beneficial. And that can actually result in people being worse off than not even receiving the assistance. And then in states where there's a higher proportion of white Americans in poverty needing the programs, and those programs actually are less conditional and lead to better outcomes. So TANF is actually a program that has increased the white-black child poverty gap by 15%, which is, I can't look at a program like that and think, well, let's keep that on top of the UBI. Say, no, let's actually take that money instead of giving it to states and leading to these racist outcomes that can even be counterproductive. Let's just make sure that that gets directly to people unconditionally.
Right. Yeah, and that point that I was sort of communicating about, the cuts to social programs, it's not as if that hasn't happened, historically. They're always going to be fighting for those cuts, right? With or without UBI. So like you said, subsequently there could be another battle like for Medicare for all or whatever, right? But,
yeah. And that's the thing. The targeting is the issue. As the saying goes, programs for the poor are poor programs. Like when you make sure that a program only benefits a very small percentage of the population because they're the ones deemed the most, worthy or something of it, then it's a lot easier for everyone else to fight that program because they're not benefiting from it. As soon as you have a fully universal program, because everybody is benefiting from it, it's a lot harder to fight against any road because people feel that they benefit.
Right on. Yeah. I actually got a question from someone on Facebook. So if you don't mind, I'll share that. Libertarian candidate Joe Jorgensen recently tweeted about UBI, claiming that you can't just keep printing money and with nothing backing it. How would you retort to that talking point?
Yeah, I actually responded to that tweet. So you can find my retort actually if you look. But yeah, so I would say that that as I told her, first of all, she's incorrect in this assumption that UBI is about like monetary financing and just like printing a bunch of money and then showering it down on everybody. So it's not more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. And if you think that's what it is, obviously you're going to think prices are going to rise and that kind of thing. But it's not the way that most UBI that we're talking about. We're saying that we're going to tax fund it. It's more like we're changing the hands of those who have like a lot and not spending it to those who don't have enough and aren't able to spend. And when you do that, it's just not the same inflationary impact. It's the same number of dollars chasing the same amount of stuff. It's just in different hands. And then you can still have some kind of effects there, but at the same time, we have a extremely productive economy that is not even close to utilizing 100% of our productive capacity. So we're at about actually 70% of our productive capacity right now. And so if you were to actually create money and actually provide it through monetary financing, even then, you would just increase that from 70% to say 80% or 90% or something. But until it reaches 100%, then you're not going to see price increases because you're just meeting the demand that you can meet. It's when you run up against supply limits that's when prices have to start increasing. And we're not even close to that. We have we produce more than enough food for everybody. We in fact waste half of the food that we create. The latest analysis of there's 31 homes per homeless person. At least that was as of like last year. I don't even know what it is right now, but there's plenty of these resources out there, and we just need to make sure people have the money to buy it.
Right. Can you talk about two things? One would be, there's a balance of, UBI, sort of a race against automation displacing employees, right? To sort of balance that out, counter that, right? But then, the flip side of that is from the, I imagine the opposition is largely from, the oligarchy, if you will, right? And I can't quite figure out why they would oppose it, because you're literally putting steady cash into their displaced former employees' hands to elevate them, right, as customers. So can you talk about those two things, automation and why they would oppose that?
Yeah, so I think the reason, especially on the left, that there's some confusion here is that I think there's a misunderstanding that UBI is mostly about money. And again, like that's an important part of it, obviously, but really, again, the unconditionality is the most important part. Unconditionality is power. And this is actually goes back to why didn't the guaranteed income pass under Nixon? What was it that stopped it in the Senate Finance Committee? And there was actually, there's multiple reasons why, but one of the major characters was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee was Russell Long. And Russell Long's response was his concern was, quote, "Who will I find to like press my shirts?" And so he was worried that people who had the power to say no to ironing his shirts for him, would mean that he couldn't find anyone to iron his shirts. So it shows that there's a power differential there, where so much like low wage work happens because at that wage that they're able to command, because they have no power to refuse to do that. And so once you have that unconditional floor where you actually can say no to these employers who are taking advantage of their employees, well, then things get interesting, where you can say, hey, I'm not going to work for you unless you pay me $15 an hour or $20 an hour. And maybe certain employers don't want that kind of people to have that power. It also empowers unions. So if right now unions have to have like this pot through their union dues that enables a strike, and let's say they have 2 months that they have enough saved up to handle like a strike that lasts 2 months, and they need to make sure that they're able to negotiate a new deal before that time because they can't last longer than 2 months. Well, with the UBI, then suddenly there is no limit to the amount of time you can strike, because there is no requirement to have that union dues that pay that $1,000 a month, which actually is what the most big kind of recent union strike that happened was actually $250 a week. So it really was like basic income amount of money. So yeah, if you're like, say, rich business owner who's taking advantage of their employers, you may understand that, and you may not like that idea.
Right. Yeah, that's I'm going to just summarize that. So basically they're just being a-holes so they can't exploit their employees. Right? To say that as politely as I can, right? If there's no risk in going on strike, yeah, that's
yeah. So much of the system exists as it does because we do not have the power to refuse all these conditions that are actually terrible for us.
right. So let me ask about perspective on this. So again, Andrew Yang obviously ran and furthered the conversation on UBI probably better than anybody in my lifetime, right? So that makes me think there is a generational split in how UBI is viewed. Is that true? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is across countries too, where survey after survey that I see actually shows that the most support is among the younger demographics. And so pretty much the younger, the more popular it is, and the older, the less popular it is.
Right.
And that does seem to show that this is an issue where as soon as people, who are 18 to 30 right now, they come into power in their 30s and 40s, and UBI is definitely going to happen. The question is, if we can make it happen sooner than that. But there is definitely an understanding of the importance of it. I think that's a greater amount among those who are younger.
Right on. And it's not like automation is going to slow down, just the opposite. It's going to accelerate, right? So, the sooner we get ahead of that.
Yeah. And the thing about
again,
I was just going to say, sorry. I just wanted to say that the thing about automation too is that it's not just like a matter of creating unemployment or employment. What it does is, because again that we require people to have jobs, then the people whose jobs are automated have to go back into the labor market, and then they're competing against each other for the jobs that remain. And the jobs that are being created are mostly these low skill, kind of low income jobs. And so what happens is automation is actually pressing down on wages too, and it has been for decades. So that's another issue, that if you're younger, then all you can find are jobs that just don't pay enough at all. And so you need to have that base to supplement.
Right on. So yeah, I just wanted to share your website because you do have a really great FAQ on here. You have news stories, but I'm not seeing it here. Blog, somewhere there's an FAQ. You have, I'm asking some questions kind of around some basic topics and stuff, but Scott's website, I encourage anyone viewing this or viewing it later to go check it out, because, it is comprehensive. You've covered all questions, not just the ones I'm sort of throwing at you here now. So, go check out his website and learn more. And, there's probably an answer there for, any question that you might have. So go check out scottsantens.com. And, I'm sure that is, that has been growing because you're out in the field and just having questions hurled at you month after month.
Yeah. That was the purpose it served, was that if I found myself answering the same question over and over and over again, then I thought, all right, I need to write something about this, so I could just send a link instead of like explaining the same stuff over and over again.
And then of course I bring you on to repeat yourself again and again. Happy
to.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining this. And I'd love to have you back on anytime. I said this before we jumped on. This is one of those things, like, we have to keep telling the story, right? So it's not a one and done. This is something that's growing, right? So anytime you want to come back on, I'd love to have you. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about UBI that you've experienced?
Well, I guess I've already covered some of the main ones, but still, I would say, because we haven't talked about it yet, too, that this conception that basic income is extremely expensive, and it's just not, because the big misunderstanding is this gross cost price tag instead of the net cost price tag. So to try to explain what I mean there is that everyone is receiving basic income, but also everyone is paying for it. And so everyone is essentially paying for their own basic income with different amounts. And so if you're paying $12,000 a year for $12,000 a year, then you haven't paid anything and the government hasn't paid anything. The net is zero. And so everyone who is paying more than they are receiving in basic income, there's no cost there, because they're effectively paying for their own basic income. And then you have to subtract out the cost for those below that who are net recipients, so that, if someone is paying $1,000 for $12,000, then the cost is $11,000. It's not the full $12,000. Right. And so when you look at the full net cost, it's actually around, depending on like your what you set the rates at for taxes and how you choose to fund it, we can say around 30% of the full gross cost is the net cost. And so that means in the US, the net cost of like a full poverty abolishing basic income is less than $1 trillion. And then if we look back and say, all right, so what is the cost of not having a basic income? And so what are the full costs of poverty? That's, what are the costs of crime? What are the costs of poor health? What are the costs of poor, low productivity? Put all these costs together. What is that? What is that total amount? Well, interestingly, if you just look at child poverty alone, that's already over $1 trillion because child poverty is extremely expensive. So there you go. Like, is it expensive to save over $1 trillion by spending less than $1 trillion? Well, no, it's actually a great deal.
Right. Yeah, and put that up against the Trump's tax cut, right? And that we could have had this in lieu of that.
Yeah. And the thing that I really dislike about tax cuts and all these tax subsidies and these tax expenditures are there's like invisible forms of welfare. And so if you're getting like a home mortgage interest rate deduction, and let's say it's equivalent to $10,000 per year, and that enables you to live in this nicer house than you would otherwise, then you're getting something from the government. Like, they're helping you by actually providing that assistance. But instead you see it as your own money, and they're just not taking it from you, instead of like receiving this check with your name on it from the government. And if you got that check, then you would say, oh, well, they're helping me. And so I think that's part of the problem of our kind of fallen social cohesion and lack of trust in government, and this feeling that like it's not helping us because it actually is, but in so many invisible ways. And I think it's important to make that visible.
Right on. Yeah. Is there any other than the pilots? Is there any kind of legislation happening either at a federal level or a state level that you want to promote, or more generally, how can people help?
Well, I guess I'll mention too that it's exciting. It's an exciting development that there's the Mayors for Guaranteed Income initiative that has started, and that was launched with 11 mayors, and now it's up to 25, including my own mayor here in New Orleans. So we're going to do a pilot here too. But that's great to see, mayors getting on board and saying, how can we do something in our own city to help show that this works. And so that's one way to help, is just, people can reach out to their mayors and say, hey, I think that our city should become part of this and we should do something here. And as far as like, say, bills and stuff, I think the closest is the recurring cash payments bills that have been proposed in Congress. And so there's 3 primary ones. There's the Emergency Money for People Act in the House, and there's the ABC Act in the House. And then there's, Bernie's and Kamala's bill in the Senate. And 2 of those, actually all of them, would do $2,000 a month. And then there's various clawback rates according to, and then like how long they last. But this is like a monthly amount of cash to get us through this crisis. And I think it's important to pass something like that. Like, we need to show that it would be extremely effective to actually make sure that people actually have the money to pay for their monthly bills. We should not be having a mass eviction crisis. Everyone should be able to pay the bills over those. We should not have giant lines for food banks. We should make sure that people can actually go to the stores to buy food instead of relying on food banks. And so I suggest people go to bailoutthepeople.com, and there's some ways you can get involved, and it helps you like contact your legislator about these bills. It helps you like write letters to them and sign various petitions to try to build up support for that. So I think that that's really what we need to make sure that happens, next year, and hopefully a Biden presidency, is that we get some kind of monthly stimulus payment so that we can recover.
Yeah, right on. And that was bailoutthepeople.com was the website that you said, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then of course your website, scottsantens.com. Go check out
Yeah.
Scott, and
And
support.
also I
Good.
was just going to say too, on September 19th, there's the Basic Income March, and that's the second annual Basic Income March. We did the first one last year. And so I believe it's 40 cities so far have signed on around the world to do various marches there. And so if check basicincome.march.com, see if there's a march in your city or close to it, and maybe you can get involved there. And it's also not too late to potentially plan your own in your city too.
Right. Yeah. If there's not one, start one, create
Yeah.
one. Right. I like what you said about the mayor's initiative, right? If there's a local, on a local level, you can either start a march, contact your mayor, and start, advocating for this locally, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for indulging me on this set of questions. Like I said, I'd love to talk to you anytime. I could talk to you all day. I have a billion questions, but
Yeah, no, happy
obviously.
to.
Yeah, and like you said, I think this is somewhat inevitable, right? So the sooner we get to it, assuming we can outrun climate change or whatever, the sooner we get to it, the more beneficial it will be, right? And the sort of happier and healthier we'll be, right? So any delay in this is just prolonging our own suffering, like you said, food bank lines, et cetera, right? So health,
Yeah.
right? All that stuff.
Yeah.
So
I tie this into climate change too. I'm looking at the fires burning on the West Coast, and I'm looking at the hurricane that just hit here in Louisiana. And it's just like we can't tackle climate change. I think partially because it's really hard to say think about the end of the world when all you can think about is the end of the month.
yeah,
It's the short term versus long term thinking. And if we actually have an economically secure population, then that's when people can start thinking about the bigger problems and the bigger issues and actually tackling those things instead of just being, look, I don't care about that stuff. I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent this month. I've got my family to feed. I just need to make sure that I keep this job that's like spewing greenhouse gases into the sky. I don't care. I just need that money. So all these things tie together.
yeah, and that's such a great point, and let me get you to talk about this as well. I just watched that film, Public Trust, and they make a point in there about the stipends that Alaskans get from fossil
Mm-hmm.
fuels, right? And while that sounds good, it's not UBI, and it actually incentivizes them to drill more, right? Because the more fossil fuel drills in my state of Alaska, let's say, the bigger my stipend will become, right? So that's not a UBI. It's exactly the opposite.
Well, actually, I would define it as the closest thing to UBI in the
Really?
world.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's a regularly provided. It's annual instead of monthly, but it's regularly provided, and it's per every individual and
Right.
universally in Alaska, regardless of the amount of money people are earning. So to rich and poor, there's no work requirement. It really is the closest thing in the world to UBI. Now, that also does bring up the question is, what are the best ways to fund it?
Right.
And I like the precedent that Alaska sets that says, natural resources belong to everyone.
Right.
It's not just to the corporation to drill up out of the ground and then profit from it. Like if there's natural resources, if there's natural wealth, then that should actually go to everybody.
Sure.
And I just wish that Alaska had expanded the say number of sources of revenue for it, so that it wasn't only an oil permanent fund. Like they actually looked at other things and grew it that way. And even you can actually provide revenue from green sources too. Like you can have like a percentage of solar panel revenue and wind farm revenue and this kind of thing. So it's not like they are required to keep doing this. And I actually haven't seen any studies as far as like they found that the existence of the dividend actually was the leading cause for people to want more money. It's actually, I've seen some stewarding effect saying like, this is because it's ours, we don't actually want to like open up all these preserves everywhere because like we feel that we have some ownership over this. So that's just something to consider
Right.
too.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for fielding that. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that Public Trust film. They do make that point, but I like your argument as well that there's no reason it couldn't be diversified, right?
Yeah, and it's also something I want to mention too when it comes to like other countries. So one of the questions people ask is, yeah, UBI seems like it's possible in America and in Canada and Europe and stuff, but like, what about less developed countries? Like, how can they afford such a thing? And I think then it's like, well, okay, a lot of these countries are actually very wealthy in terms of their natural resources. It's just that they're being entirely exploited by those who own those resources, and the fact that it's going outwards to other countries who want to profit from those resources. So again, it's just a very important precedent to set, to say like, look, these are our resources. Let's make sure that we all benefit from it.
Right on. Yeah. Well said. Awesome, Scott. Well, yeah, thanks for talking to me about UBI. Like I said, I'd love to chat with you again at any point. I want to keep telling this story, and check out his website. Check out bailoutthepeople.com, and the march you said is on the 19th, happening all around the country. Do you have a website for that one?
Yeah, basicincomemarch.com.
Right on. Cool. So yeah, go get involved. If there's one in Philly, you'll see me out there on the 19th. So
oh yeah, and there's also a virtual option too. So people can download. It's called the Watt app, WATT, and then you can you basically say, oh, I want to do part of the Basic Income March, and then you like say, all right, push the button to track my steps, and then you can just do walks or runs or whatever, and it'll count.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, thanks for all your advocacy in this area, and yeah, thanks for taking some time to chat with me today. I hope to talk to you again real soon, and I'll
Thanks,
see you
Eric.
around weeks on the 19th. All right on, Scott.
All right.
Thank you.
Cheers.
See you.